for people who just feel like they don't have the energy for any kind of movement, I would just say that energy is coming. That energy comes from a healthy metabolism.
I'm Ann Marie McQueen, journalist and proud 50-ish woman, and we are here looking for the true truth in perimenopause, menopause, midlife, and beyond.
Opening our minds to other possibilities is not always easy.
Hotflash Inc.
You're all woman to me. All right, Ann Marie.
Anyone who listens to this podcast will know that I've had a hard time finding help with my perimenopause and menopause symptoms over the years. Whether it was trouble sleeping or extreme anxiety or even vagina stuff, I've encountered roadblock after roadblock and doctors who don't know anything about taking care of women like me. It made everything harder than it had to be. That's why I'm so happy that there are companies like Midi Health stepping into the gap and sponsoring podcasts like this. Their supportive, comprehensive, and holistic approach to the menopause transition will provide you what we all need most: a personalized care plan. Their virtual care clinic is easy to use and covered by most insurance plans. You can chat with your specialist during an appointment or message 24/7. You don't have to deal with this alone any longer. Book your visit today at joinmidi.com. That's JOINMIDI.com. Hi there. Welcome to Hotflash Inc. Recently, I spent some time in a critical care ward, and all the nurses there were reading a book and talking about a book and healing their cycles and increasing their fertility, getting pregnant. And I kept hearing about it every day I was there. And finally, one of them said, I said, what book is it? And they said, it's Period Repair Manual by Lara Briden. I said, I know her. She is a friend of mine who I've never met because she lives in New Zealand and I live in Abu Dhabi. You would have told someone that I knew a celebrity. And when I was leaving the ward, one of the nurses yelled out, tell your friend we love her book. And I said, well, she's writing another one. And this one is going to be a doozy. And so today, I'm speaking to Lara Briden because her third book, The Metabolism Reset, is the book you need to read to cut through all of the confusion. And I have read it, all 400 pages, and I can tell you that it is worth your time. And this should be the best-selling New York Times #1 book for everyone, but also for women in perimenopause and menopause. I hope you enjoy our conversation. It is very, very interesting. Hi, Lara.
Hi, Ann Marie. Nice to see you again.
You too. And as always, we've been talking for ages. I could talk to you all day, a little bit before I pressed record. Well, I thought you were tackling the impossible dream when you said you were writing about metabolism. You know, when you're a little bit nervous for your friend and you're thinking, okay, like I know if anyone can do it, you can do it, but I'm nervous for you. And just because we know this is a crazy subject. What's a crazy subject? I think you've done a really good job. I've read the whole book and I would encourage other people to read it because it makes things seem much clearer and gentler. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And the fact that you read the whole entire book before interviewing, that's really nice too.
On my computer, by the way.
I know. I'm going to send you a print copy, but yes, you were very good to do that on your screen.
You must have got twisted up a million times, but you did it. And so the whole book is about doing things in a different way. So when you set out, what were your goals in tackling like such a problematic and huge issue?
I wanted to try to get to the heart of things. Like, as I say in the introduction, my primary passion is still menstruation and women's hormones and women's health. But like so many aspects of health, especially mental health and hormonal health, metabolic health underlies that. So this is like a way to kind of go deeper, to try to explore some of the things that really work for metabolic health. And the other thing was one of my goals, and I did say this to you off air already, but I really, it sounds silly, but like I just really wanted to write a book that wouldn't make things worse for people. You know, I've just through my own patients, I think from 25 years of working with patients, I know the cycle of kind of hope. Oh, this is going to be the diet, this is going to be it. This is going to be the diet. And then, oh, I failed at that. And it's usually because, we're women and we just sort of blame ourselves. My patients would put it through the lens of, well, I failed again. I tried something else that seemed like it should be doable, and then I failed at that. So I guess I'm hoping time will tell what people can do with the information in the book. But I really set out to create a system of troubleshooting that you can't fail at. Like I say, getting what you need as a biological creature is never going to fail. Like it's not about, the number of kilos you might lose. I didn't make any promises around that, but I do think most everyone has the opportunity to get metabolically healthier, and what that road to metabolic health is going to look for each individual person. It's going to be a little different, but the only way forward is step by step. And I think that's not something people can fail at. They can stumble and they can get started and then, that was hard. And, I decided to do these things and I haven't been doing them. But the trick is you just keep going. Basically, that's okay that you stumbled and kind of went backwards. You just sort of keep going. So I hope, that's what the book delivers.
Well, the whole thing reframes this from certainly the way I've grown up, that it's my fault, that I don't have willpower, that I haven't been able to master whatever cravings I have or exercise enough to. It's about metabolic dysfunction and insulin resistance and how those are impacting. And it's more of a brain issue than anything else. So
fundamentally, I was thinking about this morning. The thing that people need to understand, and the science is very clear on this, the things that have gone wrong in the evolutionary mismatch, or like our animal body in this current environment, food environment that we find ourselves, has essentially impaired, or in the words of one scientist, kind of broken the satiety mechanism, the hunger regulating mechanism. Not broken permanently. It's like it is fixable. But the result of that is people, through no fault of their own, just from the generation they've been born into, may feel quite abnormally hungry, like really, really hungry, hungrier than was what their brain was intending. And the other thing about it, hunger and its opposite, satiety, which is like satiation, but broader. It's like, this satiety is this feeling of, having enough energy, not naturally not eating to snack between meals. Hunger and satiety and energy expenditure toggle together. So this is, and we know this, we see this all the time. We see this with the new medications, like the GLP-1 medications that everyone's talking about. Like, they reduce hunger, but they also increase energy expenditure. This is how it works. So when hunger goes down, energy expenditure goes up, and vice versa. When hunger goes up, energy expenditure goes down. And that's the brain. That's like the survival mechanism that we've evolved to, survive. Basically, if the brain is convinced there's lots of food around, we don't have to, eat as much, and also we can burn off some of this energy. That's something that can just happen naturally. And it can't be, there's ways we can influence that for sure. And I know this, I'm speaking mainly from my experience with years and years of patients, but we can't micromanage it. We can influence it, and we can trust the body to find its way home to that, healthy regulation. But you certainly can't impose upon it some calculation that you've made of, calories. Like, I mean, I shouldn't be too scathing of the calories in, calories out thing, but it's just, it doesn't work like that. Like that's not how your brain or your mitochondria or all these different parts of your metabolism, they don't care what numbers have been calculated. Like, that's not how it works at all.
Just yesterday, my friend was showing me her new meal delivery app, and she opened it and it said 1,200 calories. And I was like, oh gosh, what are you doing? I know it's more than that. And then I was reading your book and it's 2,000 calories. Anyway, there's so many top lines, and I don't want to take away from the book, and I don't want to get too bogged down at the same time. But when you're talking about calories in, calories out, dying so hard, this concept, dying so hard, it's all based on that. If you could sort of tell people how they can begin to shift from that, reading your book is a good start. But how can they just make that beginning shift to let that go? Yeah,
I think the beginning to let that go is just to understand how dynamic the system is. Like, how intricately dynamic it is. Here's an example of a bit of research that came out a few years ago that was very startling to everyone. Made everyone kind of sit back and think, oh, okay. Because we had this logic of, well, if you do more exercise, you'll burn more calories. Like, that's logical, right? Because physical activity uses energy, sure. But actually, because the body's super smart and we're evolved to survive, what happens is if you burn energy with exercise, your body dials down all the other energy expenditures to compensate, to try to keep energy expenditure stable, which totally makes sense from a survival perspective. You can't have like one day, 100, 200,000 years ago where you have to sort of spend all day walking or move camp or something or carry a bunch of heavy stuff and suddenly require that suddenly you need twice as much food just to survive that day. Like, the energy expenditure is extremely dynamic. It's dynamic between individuals. It's dynamic within individuals, depending on, part of the menstrual cycle. It's just like so many factors. The nervous system is very involved in that. So once you start thinking about that and how it actively dials up and down to burn more calories one day or less calories some day, other days, you start to realize trying to micromanage a system like that makes no sense. And there was another kind of reframing of calories in, calories out that I recently heard, which is that really, if you think about this sort of energy balance concept, that people lost weight because they ended up burning more calories than they took in, that's only something you can look at as happened after the fact. That's not something you can set out to do because of this, how dynamic energy expenditure is, and also because of hunger. So you can't really, no animal, including humans, because we're animals, can withstand hunger, like mentally. That's not, it's a very strong drive. It's very ancient. It's like one of our main drives, and you can withstand it for a little while. I give the analogy in the book, like you can control your eating behavior or your hunger, like really to the extent that you can control breathing. So we can control our breathing sometimes if we're doing a breathing exercise, or we can hold our breath. But eventually, you're going to have to just breathe. And in a larger time scale, eventually, you're just going to have to eat. If people are hungry, they're going to eat eventually. And so the strategy then is to find ways to dial down hunger, and it's very doable. These are all the signals of safety and satiety that I talk about in the book. These are when it's going well and your gut is healthy and your liver and your nervous system, and you naturally just feel less and less hungry. And then the outcome of that you can think about after the fact is that, oh yeah, well, eventually I reached the point of, consuming fewer calories than I was expending. But that's a very different approach than setting out to do it. And every time we hear like all diets fail, 99% of diets fail, they're all talking about setting out intentionally to consistently eat less. And of course that fails because people get hungry. So I would just, for everyone listening, I would just assure you, it is possible to achieve greater satiety and just naturally not need the sugary snacks, or like just not want them. That is possible. It's a different, the way to get there is going to be different for different people, but it is always possible.
Well, it's kind of, as I've gotten older and sort of passed through menopause and midlife, one thing I'm realizing is that the muscling through things, the hardness and the struggle that we think we need to bring to change often isn't necessary. Some of the changes and the most positive growth is actually very easy. I'm not saying it's easy. It's actually very gentle and subtle. And you're not muscling and struggling and grinding. Like in the book, you say calorie counting only works with a healthy metabolism. But if you have a healthy metabolism, you won't need to count calories.
Exactly. So on that topic, what you've just been saying, being soft, I'm just finding it in my own book, actually. The Mary Oliver poem, a few lines here. Hang on. I thought I should find it. Oh yeah. Mary Oliver poem. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves.
There you go. Yeah. So throughout the book, there's so many things to talk about. But if you could sort of talk top lines of what people need to look at or can look at to start this process. You mentioned throughout Johnson's safety switch. And I think that's a very, very top line. But if you could just sort of talk about that and then just some broad strokes.
Sure. So that around Johnson's fructose survival switch. So that actually falls under the chapter, sort of part of the book where I try to explain, at least my reading of the current science, and it's all still very much up for debate what's happened, but something has gone very wrong with our modern environment and the metabolic regulatory mechanism of humans. So, and part of it that he's talking about there is, so he's a scientist called Richard Johnson. He's a lovely guy. Actually, we could interview him one day if you wanted to do a deeper dive into all of that. But he has a book out there as well called Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. And because I'm an evolutionary biologist, I really loved kind of his analysis of that. There were a couple times in our evolution where we evolved a superpower to be able to store fat. Basically, it was like, it was our survival power compared to even other animal, like, some of our relatives at the time. So, and part of that is triggered by certain combinations of nutrients in the environment that would have been happening around the time of autumn or, winter is coming sort of situation. So one of those is fructose. Now, I hesitate a little bit to bring up fructose because it's so controversial and people, it's one of the areas in this field where there's been a lot of combative, quite startling level of combative debate around it. So I'll just say for what it's worth, let me phrase it this way. He's talking about the ways high dose fructose, not fruit, we can sort of just reassurance everyone. We're not saying fruit is bad for everyone. That is 100% not what I'm saying. Not what he's saying either. But there's some evidence that certain high doses of certain, and not just fructose, but some other things too, act almost like signals or drugs. I mean, drug is maybe a poor analogy, but just like signals to the regulatory mechanism to shift into insulin resistance / fat storing mode. And so there's, so my book very much, so building on that, understanding that some of the signaling has gone very wrong, clearly, in our modern environment, which is why there's now epidemic of metabolic dysfunction and insulin resistance. Then we can think about it in those terms. Well, what are the opposite signals to that? How can we send the brain the right signals? And part of it is sheltering from sugar. So I like that you liked that phrasing. I've had some other nice feedback about that. Sheltering from, and by sugar, I do mean like high dose sugar. I mean desserts and soft drinks and sweet drinks and depending on the person, a little bit of sugar is fine, but it really depends on the person. And I try to explore some of the nuance around that. But I framed it as sheltering because it kind of has a departure from obviously the diet culture approach, which is that those foods are bad. You're sinful almost if you have these foods. It's not that. You're not a bad person for eating those things. It's that some of those foods are actively potentially harmful for your physiology and your metabolism, depending on the person, especially people who might be very vulnerable for different reasons. And so the decision to not have them is taking care of yourself, just like you would shelter from the weather or shelter from other bad things. You need to, give your body, and in this case, your brain, the regulatory mechanism in your brain, its best chance to kind of make the right decisions and feel better about things. And I think that sheltering to another way to think about it. I mean, the science is pretty clear that poor humans have been, to some degree, kind of bombarded by ultra processed food and some of these foods. Like and those are strong words to use, but like it is this sense of damage to some people have been very damaged by the food supply, not through any fault of their own, just the generation you happen to be born into. And there is also there is a multi-generational thing. So I think it's worth mentioning if people haven't heard of this, epigenetics. So the problem seems to be amplifying generation after generation because the food, not just food, but the environment that we're exposed to, we pass on, which is weird. Actually, they only discovered this like 20 years ago or so. Like we pass it on to offspring, and it's like all the different switches and the DNA gets switched on and off, and it's not that the DNA or the genes themselves change, but the switching on and off of them is carried forward into the next generation, and so. Yeah, we're now getting, kids showing signs of prediabetes. And like that never happened 50 years ago. Like 50, 60 years ago, kids could eat just the most appalling diet. Like I grew up in the 70s. We had a lot of sugar back then, like, just terrible stuff. But it was not taking the toll that it is now partly because of this epigenetics. So I mention that just because if people find, like I say in the book, like if if people find they're just metabolically struggling, so certainly maybe compared to their friends, and don't understand why, it's like that's partly why. It's just it's a combination of the genes you inherited combined with maybe a few generations of, you know, exposure to some of this damaging food. And again, not anybody's fault. Everyone was always just doing the best they can and feeding kids the best they knew how. So it's if there's anyone to point the blame at, it is the food industry for sure. And I mean, I would say that's another book, and people have written books about that. And I touch on it a little bit, and how I think future generations are really going to have to sort that out. Like they need to be reined in terms of just regulating some of these like food-like substances that are not really even food anymore.
Well, you mentioned about the tobacco companies took all their expertise about
Philip
getting
Morris
to smoke. And
Philip Morris, I had to fact check that a couple times before I put it in the book just to make sure. I'm like, am I like rubbing my eyes? Like, am I dreaming? Is that so Philip Morris bought General Foods, Kraft, I forget what the third one. Hopefully I've got the details right, through the kind of early 80s into the early 90s. Like, and then they just were like, right, we've got all this knowledge and, just machinery to start making people addicted to ultra processed food. And boy, did they succeed.
it shouldn't have been allowed. It should have been prevented. There should have been a law against it, you would think. You go into also very gently, because another hot topic is vegetable oil, sometimes called seed oils. And I see fighting about this a lot. And if you Google them, you'll either find out that they're healthy for you, or you'll find out that they're bad for you. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And
I know.
So can you, from your measured perspective, can you just sort of what the problem is?
Okay, well, the first thing to understand that makes the whole thing a little confusing, and granted, if people are confused, they're totally understandable. So this is about linoleic acid, or omega-6, particular kind of polyunsaturated fatty acid, which is an essential fatty acid. So it happens to be an essential nutrient. So there's that. So it's obviously not bad, all bad. But to be fair, it's pretty easy to get enough omega-6 just from, I think it comes from nuts and seeds and grains to some extent. So whole foods are going to deliver omega-6. And there is some omega-6 in animal foods as well, just naturally. But then the problem is the amount of it, and the sheer amount. And it's the amount of it that's coming all in the form of processed packaged food, basically. I was talking with in another interview the other day, and she was pointing out, it's not just because you say to people vegetable oil, and then they say, oh, well, I don't have any corn oil or canola oil, in my cupboard. It's like, no, but it's in all those packaged foods that it's in everything. Like if you read the label, it's got vegetable oil. That's what's there.
Healthy food. It's in a lot of healthy food. It's in nut milk.
It's in everything.
It's in everything. Yeah.
Yeah. And so scientists are concerned that the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 is part of the problem. And hasn't even been an inkling that the ratio of omega-6 to saturated fat may be a problem. Now, this is where, yes, it's very much depending on who you ask. As you saw in my book, I multiple times say, well, depending on who you ask, especially around saturated fat. But I am in the camp where I do think we're being exposed to too much omega-6. I think we do need to shelter from it. Yes, I do. And I have been sheltering it from it for decades. So certainly, that by sheltering it from it means cooking with, butter or olive oil. Fortunately, extra virgin olive oil is mostly something called oleic acid, which is very different. Oils are always a mix of things. So there is a little bit of linoleic acid in lots of different things. But sticking mainly to olive oil or coconut oil or butter, or people used to cook with obviously saturated fat and lard and things like that. And that's been a massive shift. And so I'll just touch on that a little bit because it's interesting. It's not definitive. None of it's definitively proven, but there's little signals coming from the research, like little interesting glimpses of things. One is there was a study, and the citations in my book, or I can provide it for the show notes if you want, where they've estimated that basal metabolic rate has declined in our modern generations compared to previous generations. So that's just your basal energy expenditure. Never mind all the other, compensatory or up and down energy expenditure that you get from like brown fat and stuff like that. This is just your basal rate. And in the paper, they talk about possibly from the shift from saturated fat to vegetable oil. And I think there could be different mechanisms in that. I think there is some evidence that high dose omega-6 potentially promotes insulin resistance, which is a big central part of metabolic dysfunction via different mechanisms, which is quite interesting. And then there's the fact the missing C15 saturated fat. Do you know about this? It's called anyways, it's a 15 carbon saturated fat, which is the scientists are so excited about it that they've released it as a supplement now. So you can actually supplement this type of saturated fat called C15. It's mainly in dairy, lamb, I think certain types of seafood. And so we collectively, used to eat a lot more of that. And it's very important metabolically, sort of in terms of maintaining metabolic rate and insulin sensitivity and things like that. So that's a longer answer to the whole seed oil. They're called seed oils to differentiate them from fruit oils. So fruit oils would be olive and avocado. And I know there's a lot of combative debate about it out there. Look, I mean, obviously I eat out in restaurants. Like I will eat things that have seed oils. I mean, you have to, you can't avoid them entirely, but I think it seems logical to me to try to avoid them when cooking, as much as possible at home and cooking at home. And I suspect the needle will move on this. I think we're still in the debate stage, but if it starts to become more proven, I think we're going to start to see maybe in some of the, restaurants, already some restaurants are talking about, cooking without vegetable oil. So we'll see if that happens in the coming years.
Well, it's incredibly expensive. And I know when I was trying to get a meal plan, there's so many meal plans over here. And I was asking around, I only found 2 that set out to use it. So people do need to know that things will be labeled healthy. This is a big sort of scam kind of. And I don't even know if they know and they're doing it on purpose, or they don't even know.
Well, this is why vegetable oils are so prevalent, is they're cheap. This is why they're in processed food and all restaurant food, not because, there was the 1970s whole, to get away from saturated fat, they thought vegetable oil was good, but it was actually also, it was very convenient for food processing companies because it's extremely cheap. So so with the meal plans, you mean like the meal delivery services?
Yeah, meal delivery. I'm single, so I sometimes when I don't have time and I'm coming back from a trip or something, I never like them. But it amazes me that there's 150 healthy meal deliveries and 2 that I can find that are using. But I mean, shift your business to using avocado oil or olive oil, you would have a much different bottom line, I think.
Totally. Well, they're going to have to charge more. They will have to charge more. So in the book, I do talk about using those meal delivery services, and then maybe just taking the other ingredients, but using your own oil or your own sauces, like maybe just substituting a good quality olive oil. And that's one way to handle it, I think. Yeah.
I have started saying in restaurants that I'm allergic to it.
Yeah.
I've turned into that person. Still probably it's being used somewhere, but I heard that from someone else. And I feel like that's a tip because, they often say now, do you have any food allergies? And it's like, why, yes, I do. Vegetable oil. So there are so many things in there, circadian rhythm, metabolic gut dysbiosis. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah.
Metabolic endotoxemia.
Yes.
Can you explain that?
Memory. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so this is where I do bring my naturopathic, lens to some of this. I mean, it's in the science too. It's not just a naturopathic opinion, but gut health has a huge impact on metabolic health. And so what you just described, the word you just said, metabolic endotoxemia, that's when essentially from intestinal permeability and moving into the body of what's called lipopolysaccharide or LPS, only just for people who are interested in the technical terms. People don't have to remember those. And it creates quite a bit of inflammation. And it actually also sort of moves in potentially into the body generally, into the blood supply, but also just can affect visceral fat specifically. And I find that extremely interesting that intestinal permeability can promote the hypertrophy of visceral fat, and hypertrophied or enlarged or unhealthy inflamed visceral fat actually sends all these weird signals to the brain and can directly interfere with all the signaling around satiety and hunger. So inflamed visceral fat can actually just make you abnormally hungry in the simplest terms. And the gut can affect that. And now it's so interesting because, I mean, of course, I've got lots of patient stories in the book. And then I'm still seeing patients, not as many as I used to, but I had a patient recently. And it was almost like she was straight out of the book. I'm like, you could have been a patient story. So I'll just give it as an example. So she did have quite strong insulin resistance. We knew that from some blood testing we did. That wasn't actually her main focus, though, which is totally fair enough because she also had pelvic pain and she had SIBO. Will your listeners know what SIBO is? Or, yeah, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Yeah.
Can you go into it a tiny bit?
So it's just when there's a overgrowth of the gut bacteria in the small intestine where there's really not supposed to be that many bacteria in the small intestine. It's quite common. It's when people bloating after meals and a lot of intestinal bloating. It's a major driver, not the only driver, but it's a major driver of intestinal permeability. So I just really wanted to help her with her gut and her pelvic pain to start with. And so I did the old naturopathic thing, which is, okay, let's do 8 weeks of wheat-free, dairy-free. And she was already eating some whole foods. So her diet wasn't bad, but she was just having normal stuff, yogurts and bread and all the things. And so, and I was really just trying to toggle the pain. Like I was trying to reduce the pain. So I gave her, some weeks off wheat and dairy. And then I did give her the herbal medicine berberine, which is in the book, but I didn't prescribe it for her insulin resistance. I actually prescribed it for the gut, like to help to knock back SIBO, for its antimicrobial effects. And I talked to her, she did about 5 weeks doing that. And she felt the pain was gone, which was great. And bloating was much better. But she said, and my afternoon cravings for sugar just disappeared, like completely just went away. And I was like, yeah, that's showing in action. That's the dynamic system. I mean, that she didn't. So what a better way to come at it than be like, I'm going to mentally, using my sheer willpower, stop myself from having the sugar that I'm craving. And in her case, by treating the underlying inflammation, which was treating the gut, really, she just had that natural relief. Now, I'm not saying that's going to be like that for every single person. This is why the book's a troubleshooting manual. That is a common scenario, actually, but it's not the only way. It's not the only way to achieve better satiety. But looking at all of this and all the metabolic debate and some of the low carb diets, I have to say, I think one of probably several mechanisms that low carb diets can improve metabolic health is by improving gut health. That's because a low carb diet is almost by definition the diet for SIBO or bacterial overgrowth. So it's a low carb diet is antimicrobial for the gut. Like it can in a good way knock back some of that overgrowth in the small intestine. So I've actually got I realized there's 10 patient stories in the book. I was trying to illustrate all the different ways, types of interventions or things that people respond to, but 2 of them are actually about treating the gut, which makes sense. That represents my patient population too, because, well, just to say again, I mean, I'm a naturopath, so we do come back to the gut quite often. And I had to, of course, put that in there.
And of course, to explain to people, the visceral fat is different from the fat you can grab. It's in underneath and by your organs. And this is where you'll feel a thickening, but you won't necessarily, or this
you can't squish it.
Yeah. But you will notice the larger the expansion and discomfort.
It'll be quite hard. The people, I mean, it depends on how expanded or how hypertrophied or grown it is, but people, the one I've seen the most from patients is this hard little bulge right under the rib cage. This and people find it quite uncomfortable, but you can't put calipers, you can't, and it is possible. Obviously, you can also have squishy subcutaneous fat on the belly as well. That's not the belly fat that everyone's talking about. The visceral fat, the unhealthy belly fat, is inside the abdomen. And the good thing about it, though, it's the first to reduce. Actually, it reduces more quickly than subcutaneous fat, which is a good thing. And here's an interesting thing. I did put it in the book. I'll just mention it for everyone today, that I just love this about female physiology, that lower body subcutaneous fat, especially bum fat, is arguably actively anti-inflammatory. So there's a bit of research showing that if you're going to have hypertrophied visceral fat or that unhealthy belly fat, and you can't always tell by looking, but you can sort of maybe tell by waist measure. If you have that, it's actually good to also have quite a bit of subcutaneous fat because it seems to sort of mitigate or offset some of the risk, which is quite interesting.
Also speaks to this amazing capacity of the body to balance. And now I should have asked you this at the beginning. What is insulin resistance and how do you know you have it?
So, I mean, the book's about metabolic dysfunction, which is kind of a nebulous term, but what I'm precisely talking about is metabolic inflexibility and insulin resistance. And the two terms are quite similar and they overlap quite a lot, but and they reinforce each other. But metabolic inflexibility is this reduced ability to access body fat stores for energy, and kind of a more heavy reliance on more in the glucose burning mode of physiology. Never exclusively, we're always burning a mix of the two fuels, fat and carbs, fat and glucose. But insulin resistance is basically the situation of, well, obviously certain tissues, not all the tissues in the body, but especially the liver, has a reduced sensitivity to the hormone insulin, and that's associated with chronically elevated insulin. And the chronically elevated insulin is part of the problem because it actually, when insulin stays high, it impairs fat burning. So this is how it kind of feeds back to metabolic inflexibility. It's hard to access your body fat stores for the energy you need, not just for weight loss, but like to actually have energy and be able to go between meals without eating, because you have to be able to, get that energy. Chronically elevated insulin impairs that. It does lots of other bad things too. So the chronically elevated insulin is it's common. I mean, some estimates are it's almost 1 in 2 adults. Like it's quite a lot of people. And it can progress to prediabetes and diabetes. But with insulin resistance, insulin is chronically elevated, but glucose can be normal for like a couple of decades like that. In fact, with insulin, the early stages of insulin resistance, glucose would sometimes be low. Like I had this very interesting conversation with someone on my social media I did a post about hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. And she's like, oh, well, I get low blood sugar. Therefore, I thought I must not have insulin resistance because insulin resistance is about high blood sugar and I have low. So I must have the opposite. I'm like, no. Actually, low blood sugar is a common symptom of insulin resistance. Especially something called reactive hypoglycemia, or like low blood sugar a few hours after eating, is a classic symptom of insulin resistance. So, I've heard it talked about, we need to sort of shift the focus from all about glucose to actually thinking about the hormone insulin. Another really classic sign, in answer to your question, how do you diagnose it? We can talk about a few of the blood tests, but one thing I want to say right away is fatty liver. So fatty liver is classic sign of insulin resistance. There are other explanations for fatty liver. So obviously the doctor needs to, rule out other things. But if there's no other explanation, then it is insulin resistance. That is definitely kind of what's going on. And again, a lot of my patients don't understand that. They think, well, I've got, they sort of have these like thinking separate things are going on. Well, I've got this, I can't lose weight. And also I've got, fatty liver. They might not have connected them, but insulin resistance is what ties them together. So there's different ways to test. I have a whole chapter on assessment. Depending on, it doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be fancy testing or anything. People can do it on their own, not, partly on their own, and then partly just looking at some of the normal blood tests that their doctor has already done. Like, for example, a couple of the classic signs of insulin resistance are high triglycerides, which most people will have had done as part of just a lipid panel, especially high triglycerides and low HDL. That ratio is really common. And high ALT. So I do mention it because people might have that. So in women, ALT is quite sensitive. So that's a good marker. So in women, it should be below 19, I think it's international units per liter or something like that. The units are the same in most countries, I think, for ALT. So I'm not to get too technical on everybody, but they can pull out their old blood result that they had. And again, just to acknowledge there can be other explanations for that. Certainly if a lot of the liver enzymes are out of range, and if the doctor has said there's some other reason for what's going on with their liver, then something different. But if it's just sort of a standalone finding, then high ALT is a sign of both fatty liver and insulin resistance. So, and also you can measure the hormone insulin, but measuring glucose or blood sugar is not a way to diagnose insulin resistance.
Theoretically, you would think that it would be a standard test and you could catch people early and then advise them, but it's not nearly at that place. It seems like you can just look at how you feel and say, hey, I might have the early stages of insulin resistance, and then pull some of the levers that you mentioned in your book.
Yeah.
So what would
Yeah.
be just some of those, if people are listening, like what would be some of those signs? The hunger.
Yeah, well, increased hunger. So abnormally increased hunger, weight gain around the middle, especially that thickening, hard, like kind of quite hard, like solid around, and you can measure the waist um, to kind of get a sense of that. Just some other high blood pressure, high cholesterol, skin tags is a common one. So there's a few signs. Family history of insulin resistance, family history of prediabetes, having a history of polycystic ovary syndrome, potentially, depending on the type of polycystic ovary syndrome. Yeah, a history of gestational diabetes can be a risk as well. So all these things. And then in terms of treatment, yeah, there's not. This is the whole point of my troubleshooting approach in the book. There's some general guidelines, of course, but there's not one size fits all for reversing insulin resistance. It really is, the approach I take is identifying what are the metabolic obstacles that are preventing your body, because your body wants to be insulin sensitive. It's trying to get there. Like it would like to be healthy. So what is it that is potentially standing in the way? And one of the examples I do give, I talk through a number of different things, but I do want to tie in Hashimoto's thyroid disease because it's quite common in women, and it does intersect with all of this, and it does increase the risk of insulin resistance, probably via a few mechanisms. So I have at least one patient story where that was kind of her main, in that patient's case, like that was the metabolic obstacle she needed to tackle to try to turn insulin resistance around, together with all the normal things, like sheltering from sugar and ultra processed food and eating enough protein and potentially eating, the good kinds of oils.
And Hashimoto's is autoimmune. Can you explain just briefly?
Yeah, it's an autoimmune thyroid disease. So it's when the immune system has formed antibodies or inflammation against the thyroid, and it's not exclusively women, but it's mainly women. It's very rare to come across. Men can get other kinds of autoimmune thyroid disease, but the Hashimoto's one is mainly women. And yeah, it's quite common. I think we're starting to get an idea now from the science of why autoimmune disease in general is more common in women, but thyroid is usually the first one to show up. It's not unusual to have constellations either. So if women can get autoimmune thyroid sort of happening, and then they might be at risk for other autoimmune processes. But yeah, and autoimmune, fortunately, there's ways to improve that. A lot of it, again, comes back to the gut and intestinal permeability.
Did you know I also have a Substack? That's a fancy way of saying I have a newsletter. Each week, I share research, news, products, tips, and tricks from the world of menopause and midlife. Sometimes I even write an essay about my own life and what I'm going through. Hotflash Inc. on Substack is where I pull together everything that's here and in the menosphere and break it all down so we can try and make sense of it all. Join more than 5,000 women, practitioners, CEOs, and more, and become a subscriber today. You can also get my podcast and special video and audio drops you can't get anywhere else. Sign up today at hotflashinc.substack.com. Okay, so we talk about perimenopause a lot here. Perimenopause and insulin resistance have a special relationship, not a good relationship. What's going on
No.
there?
The way I frame it now, for people who just feel like they don't have the energy for any kind of movement, I would just say that energy is coming. That energy comes from a healthy metabolism. So you could just start with some of the simpler things, like the supplements I talk about, or some of the, getting more protein, or just like some of the getting circadian rhythm, taking your coffee outside in the morning, getting some light, because circadian rhythm is huge in all of this. Start with the easier things and know that you're going to start to have more energy for moving the body. And so when that energy starts to appear, like, harness it and carve out some time in your day because movement is pretty crucial, but it doesn't have to be, exercise. I guess, it has to be, we do need to build some muscle, especially that's the other thing that happens at menopause. Actually, that's the other part of the puzzle. Because estrogen is normally anabolic and helps keep our muscles, especially the bum muscle, kind of keeps a lot of muscle happening. And yeah, we do start to lose that. I'm a bit naughty, actually. I did an interview last week. She was so shocked when I told her I don't actually do strength training. I thought she was going to fall off her chair. Like she was just, how could you? Like, She looked really shocked. I'm thinking she may edit that part out actually, because so in my defense, I'll just say I
Haram, as we
understand
say in the Middle East. Haram, Lara. No, but
that.
look, you do mention this in your book, and we are
Yeah,
harped at protein, 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 which
yeah,
I'll just interject that you also really clarified that for me, that we're
yeah,
designed to eat protein and seek protein. So a lot of our hunger might be that we're not eating enough protein. That's why,
yeah,
that's a
yeah,
biological reason for why you might still be
yeah,
hungry. You're not eating enough protein, your body wants it.
yeah.
But we're just yelled at these days to eat protein, so much protein, protein all the time, and lift heavy, lift heavy, lift heavy.
I
And you're
know.
naughty because you don't lift heavy, but you are, how do you justify that?
Right. So I'll just say a couple, and also say there is actually, just to make things even more complicated, that there is a place for occasional low protein. I have a small section in chapter 13. Like there are some if people are really like deep into insulin resistance and have like serious problems, anyway, you can look at that section and follow some of the research that I point to from there. There can be a place for not continuously low protein, but kind of cyclic low protein can move the needle a bit on things. But because protein is an interesting nutrient that way. But in terms of my own, what I do, so yeah, I'll never forget that interview. She did look very, very shocked. So I do believe about the lifting, and I may still do some in my life. But I guess what I have done, because I love walking, so I can't get enough of it. Like I go for like 3 walks a day, and I love yoga, and I totally acknowledge that not everyone does. So I get that. Like I like it for all the nervous system, autonomic nervous system benefits. Like I'm like the kind of person, I'm like a little like, I say to my husband, like, I can't understand, like, I honestly genuinely can't understand how you don't do yoga. Like, how can
Yeah.
you survive? Like, how can you sleep?
Yeah.
Or like, how could anything actually happen if you don't do yoga? In my body, that's how much I need yoga. And totally acknowledging that some people don't feel that way or have a little like nervous, anxious nervous system like mine. But what I'm doing, listening to the research, is I am doing some like strength components to yoga, like in pretty serious ones. Like I was doing some squats and planks and stuff the other day, and I thought, you know what? I'd be curious to know if some of these heavy lifters, how they would be doing with this, yoga pose at this moment where my glutes are trembling and like. So there's different way to build muscle. There's Pilates. You can use your own body weight for some of this strength building. And one of the things I worry about with too clear a message around you have to lift heavy and that's the only thing you can do. And sometimes I hear from patients, it's like, well, for whatever reason, I can't do that or I don't want to do that. So what's the point? Like, I just won't do anything then. And I think most experts agree, just find something you like doing, like some way of moving your body that you genuinely, at least if not enjoy, like at least can tolerate and are going to be willing to do it on a consistent basis, because this is not just a one-time thing, right? Like this has to be every week, something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It has to be far better. And I don't know that we have the long-term studies to compare this or that. I'm like you, I struggle with weightlifting. And then I try to remember generations before me. I don't remember anyone at Barry's or F45 doing like a weight class or like, I don't know if they have barbells. I think that they were okay because they were doing their regular life lifting and bending and stretching. So I don't know. People will say Aunt and Ann Marie, they all died at 50, but we know that that's not true.
No, they didn't. I mean, to be fair, our more ancient ancestors were probably just lifting doing a lot of stuff, like carrying their grandchildren and like setting up camp and probably just a lot of general lifting. So I mean, I believe the research on the lifting. I don't dispute that. I'm just saying we're not perfect, right? Like we have to find the thing, and there's only so many hours in the day. And I guess through my lens, I am just not willing to give up yoga for lifting at this point because I need yoga to sleep. So, you have to weigh it up.
This is what I love about you. You just your gentle confidence in the face of overwhelming discussions otherwise, but we don't need to feel worse about what we're not doing at this time.
No.
I think that's probably even, I don't have any studies to back it up, but I think that's probably even more damaging. So, well, I can't thank you enough. And, this book is really quite something. I would encourage everyone to read it, and I'll follow what you do next with great interest. Thank you so much, Lara. Always a pleasure.
Yes. Thanks, Ann Marie.
Thanks. Thank you so much for listening to my interview with Lara Briden. One of the things that I was just so impressed at with her book is that this is a time when we need to start coming back to ourselves and looking at ourselves as a biological creature who needs to be cared for and well. In the interview, you heard Lara talking about, you have to do things for your pet every day. You have to do things for yourself every day. And I absolutely love that. I personally need to spend more time on social interaction. It's not that I don't have friends, I do. But I can tend to be kind of a loner because I am an introvert. And I've been grieving the death of my father, and I haven't wanted to be around anyone, but I realize now that I need to. And I kind of think the overarching thing that her book does is it sort of pulls back the curtain on this Wizard of Oz like scenario that our body's in, where it's just a bunch of levers that move. And when you pull one, another one goes up like an orchestra. It really is an orchestra. And so she gives you the tools to say, okay, let's go in and here, what are some of the easiest things to address, some levers to adjust that will create a cascade effect. In our interview, and she says, your energy is coming. I think we all need to remember that this is about energy. It's not just about being thin. Please, can we put that down? And can we focus on, do I feel like getting out of the chair? Do I feel like getting up in the morning? Am I sighing because everything is hard? Or do I have energy? Is the food I'm putting in my mouth working and going right down into fueling my mitochondria? And my journey in the last couple of years, because she talks a lot about, endotoxemia and intestinal permeability and SIBO, and I had all of these things. And my experience in this journey has been, yes, it's been a lot of work, but yes, I don't have to work so hard. The weight does kind of fall off and the energy comes. And that is a beautiful, beautiful thing of being human. So I can't recommend this book enough. I suggest you get it and read it and get a pen and get a notebook. And, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but if you're on a plan that starts Monday, or you think weekends are hard, or, you've got to be good and you need to get back to what you're doing, or you need to do it this way, or you're confused by what everyone's saying, this is the book that will help you start to pay attention to the beautiful cues that your body gives you, because you'll start getting them. Thank you so much. See you next week.
Hotflash Inc. was created and is hosted by Ann Marie McQueen, produced and edited by Sonia Mack. The information contained in this podcast is intended for informational purposes only and is not intended for the purpose of diagnosing, treating, curing, or preventing any disease. Before using any products referenced on the podcast, consult with your healthcare provider, read all labels, and heed all directions and cautions that accompany the products. Information received through the podcast should not be used in place of a consultation or advice from a healthcare provider. If you suspect you have a medical problem, i.e. menopause or anything else, or any healthcare questions, please promptly see your healthcare provider. This podcast, including Ann Marie McQueen and any producers or editors, disclaim any responsibility from any possible adverse effects from the use of any information contained herein. Opinions of guests on this podcast are their own, and the podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about a guest's qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements and advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. This podcast is owned by Hotflash Inc. Media.